there is two parts to the central nervous system. We just got done covering the first part, the brain. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the spinal cord, the second part. Is it a new chapter? Yes, it is chapter 14, 1-4, which, by the way, was my lacrosse number when I played, in case you were wondering. Okay. So when we talk about the spinal cord, okay, the spinal cord is pretty much the connection, right, or the highway, the bidirectional highway between the brain and the periphery of your body, okay? So in the spinal cord, we are going to discuss the conduction pathways. Remember the pathways? Do y'all remember all the different pathways? Remember we had the commissural pathways in the brain? Those were the pathways that fibers or axons cross from one side of the cerebral hemisphere to the other side of the cerebral hemisphere. So they allowed opposite sides of the cerebrum to talk to one another. Okay? And then we had association. And association, all right, pathways allowed different areas in the same hemisphere to communicate with one another. Okay? You could have the frontal lobe communicate to the occipital lobe. Or you could have one gyri communicate to the gyri right next to it. All right, those were the association pathways. Now, we're going to talk about the conduction pathways. And these are the ones that go up and down. Okay? There's some in the brain. Okay? But we're going to talk about the ones here. Well, we're actually going to talk about the ones in the brain too, but we're going to discuss the ones here in the spinal cord. There's a couple that we're going to go through. All right? So that's why I want to kind of take it nice and slow. All right, in today's class when we're discussing some of these pathways here. Okay, so a couple things we have to go over. Sensory pathways are also known as ascending pathways. That means that they go up to the brain. Okay, from the spinal cord up to the brain. Motor pathways are also known as descending pathways. That means they come down from the brain into the spinal cord out to the body. Okay? Got to know that. Okay, so some of the characteristics of conduction pathways are, all right, they are paired, which means you have one on the left side of the body and one on the right side of the body. All right, and you also need to understand where these cells are located. All right, because this is where those terms come into play when we talk about nuclei and tracts in the central nervous system. And then in the peripheral nervous system, we call the same things something different. We call them ganglia and we call them axons. Okay? So the axons in the central nervous system are called tracts. And the cell bodies or the somas, all right, in the peripheral nervous system are called ganglia. Okay? So we're dealing with, all right, this is important, the cell bodies, all right, are in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so we therefore call them ganglia. All right, we'll also see them in the spinal cord gray horns, right, and in gray matter. Now we're up in the brain, and they're known as gray matter, then they are known as a nucleus. Okay. So we're going to have different names for some of these structures. You just need to know, all right, that when I say nucleus and ganglia, it's a cluster of cell bodies, and it just has to do with this location. A ganglia is in the peripheral nervous system, all right, and a nucleus is in the central nervous system. Okay? So when we're talking about the axons, those are known as tracts in the spinal cord. All right, the cell bodies are going to be in three different places. Okay? The ganglia, the gray horns, we'll talk about all this stuff, and then in the brain, in the gray matter in the brain, and those nuclei there. Okay? So these pathways are going to be made up of at least 2 or more neurons. Can be 3, can be 4. Okay? But at least 2. All right? Most of these pathways will cross. That's what decussate means. Okay? And that means that they're going to innervate the opposite side of the body or receive information from the opposite side of the body, and we call that contralateral side. If they never cross, then it's going to be same side, and we call that ipsilateral. Okay? So these characteristics All right, you'll see a test question on this. All right, the pathways are paired. All right, you need to know where the cells are located. Okay, the axons are in the spinal cord, and they're known as tracts. All right, and then the cell bodies are either in the ganglion, the gray horns of the spinal cord, or up in the brain's gray matter. Okay, we'll have at least 2 or more neurons that are in these conduction pathways. A lot of these conduction pathways will cross over to the other side of the body. All right, some will stay on the same side. Okay. All right, let's start off with sensory. All right, if we have time today, which we will, we're going to go over some of the sensory pathways. So we're going to learn about how touch gets from your fingertip up to your brain. Okay. So when we talk about the sensory pathway, we're going to talk about, and we'll learn more about what the general sense receptors are. All right. But the general sense receptors are going to be pretty much all of the sense receptors outside of your head for right now. Okay. So feet, hands, toes, knuckles, ankles, elbows. Okay. So we have 2 types of receptors. The first one are somatic sensory. Okay, somatic is going to be what you can consciously perceive. Okay, so what you are aware of right now. Well, we talk about tactile receptors. That is going to be touch. Right? How hard or soft or furry or sharp or fluffy. All right, those are our tactile receptors. Proprioceptors. All right, these guys are going to tell us what our muscles and joints are doing. All right, specifically, how much stretch is going on in those tissues. And then the other type of general sense receptor are visceral sensory receptors. And remember, visceral, right? We talk about the viscera, organs, right? It will detect changes in organs. Chemoreceptors, if there's a change in the chemical component of an organ. Baroreceptors, if it's going to detect any type of stretch in an organ, like in the stomach. All right, when you just ate a big meal, your stomach stretches out. All right, that stretch information is going to travel through the visceral sensory receptors. That's what we're going to discuss. Okay, so we're going to deal with some of these pathways here. We have our somatosensory pathways, and this is pretty much going to carry information from our skin, muscles, and the joints. And then our visceral sensory pathways, all right, that's going to carry information from our organs. All right, we're going to spend more time. You get to learn about some of the visceral sensory pathways more in 211, like how your stomach starts to create digestive juices and mix things up. That's a visceral sensory pathway. Okay? All right, so when we're talking about these sensory pathways, all right, you can see here you will utilize 3 neurons, a primary, secondary, and tertiary, or first order, second order, third order neuron. Okay? So when we're starting off with the primary, that means we're going from the body, we're going to start in the body, and then we're going to wind up in the brain. So the primary neuron is always going to be in the periphery. Okay? It's going to head from like your fingertip, all right, to the spinal cord. So that's what we're going to see here. And a lot of the examples I'll be using, I'm going to use your fingertip, all right? So this one is going to have the receptor in the peripheral region, all right, of wherever it is, and the cell body is going to be in the posterior root ganglion. What the heck is that? Let me show you real quick. Some of this is going to be a little bit easier once I do the spinal cord. But here's our spinal cord, okay? Here's your spinal nerve. Spinal nerve is a nerve that comes off the spinal cord, okay? Remember, sensory information goes into the spinal cord from the periphery and up to the brain. So anyways, there's a ganglia that sits back here, okay? It's called the dorsal root ganglia or the posterior root ganglia. All right, we know that a ganglia is a clustering of cell bodies. These types of cells, all right, are a unipolar cell. What is that? You have a cell body. What the heck? You've got a cell body that has one process coming off the cell body that splits. One process goes one way, The other process goes the other way, okay? Well, this process goes all the way out to your fingertip, out to the receptors there for for touch, let's say. The other one, all right, is going to head into the spinal cord, all right, and possibly ascend up to another region, or it's going to synapse on another neuron, okay? So this one process here is like one big long dendrite, and this process over here is like the axon, okay? But anyways, this type of cell, all right, is going to be the most common type of sensory cell that you will see, or sensory neuron that you are going to see, all right, when we're dealing with sensory pathways here, okay? So the primary neuron starts in the fingertip, travels, all right, into the spinal cord. Its cell body is going to be located in that posterior root ganglion. And then the axon, all right, will then synapse onto our secondary neuron, all right, also known as an interneuron, because it's going to be between two neurons, all right? So the primary neuron synapses onto the secondary neuron, okay, stimulates the secondary neuron, receives that sensory input, and then that secondary neuron will then travel all the way to the tertiary neuron, and we'll get to this, or to the cerebellum, all right? If it goes to the tertiary neuron, it synapses onto the tertiary neuron, and then that tertiary neuron is going to travel all the way up to the somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe, all right, where you will get that conscious perception of whatever that sensory information is. All right, so that's just a general kind of generic, not story, but process here, okay? Now let's get specific. Let's talk about specific, all right, types of sensory pathways. The first one is the posterior funiculus, all right, also known as the medial lemniscal pathway. We talked about the medial lemniscus when we were talking about the midbrain, parts of the midbrain, parts of the pons, and the medulla oblongata, because the medial lemniscus, all right, carries sensory information, okay? So this pathway is going to carry, look at all the stuff that it carries: proprioception, touch, pressure, and vibration, okay? And so it involves 3 neurons. So I'll break it down. The primary neuron is going to go, for example, from the fingertip, the skin, all the way to the brainstem, okay? So the peripheral receptor is out there in the fingertip. It travels towards the spinal cord. Its cell body is in the posterior root ganglion. All right, it enters into the spinal cord through the posterior root. Into the spinal cord it enters, right? And then it is going to travel to what we call the posterior funiculus. All right? The posterior funiculus is made up of, all right, 2 structures. All right? It's either the fasciculus cuneatus or the fascicularis gracilis. All right, so what is that? Right here, okay? So here's your sensory neuron. It comes in, all right? Cell body's located here in the posterior root ganglion. It enters into the back portion of the spinal cord, all right? This is the sensory, or the dorsal or posterior root. It enters in this back area of the spinal cord, all right? That is called the posterior funiculus. And so the posterior funiculus, on each side, there's a posterior, well, this whole thing is the posterior funiculus, okay? But it's made up of the fascicularis cuneatus, all right, and the fascicularis gracilis. The cuneatus is on the lateral portion, the gracilis is on the medial portion. So basically, all right, any information in your lower extremities, okay, the lower portion, pretty much below your belly button, all right, is going to travel in the fasciculus gracilis here. Any information that comes from your upper torso, all right, and also from your upper extremities, okay, that is going to come from, all right, the fascicularis cuneatus on the lateral portion, okay? So that primary neuron is going to enter in, go to the the posterior funiculus, travel up to the brainstem, here, all right, into, depending on which one we're dealing with, if it's the nucleus gracilis or the nucleus cuneatus, depending on what one. This example here is using the fascicularis cuneatus. So it's going to synapse on the secondary neuron, all right, in the nucleus gracilis here, and then that secondary neuron is going to desiccate and cross over here in the medulla, right, and then it's going to travel up, right, into the medial lemniscus, all the way up through the brainstem, all the way up here to the thalamus. Then that will synapse onto the thalamus, onto the tertiary neuron. And that tertiary neuron will then go up to the somatosensory cortex there in the parietal lobe. All right. So, primary neuron from the skin to the brainstem enters into the posterior funiculus. Okay, travels up to the medulla where it will synapse onto the secondary neuron in either, all right, the nucleus the nucleus cuneatus or the nucleus gracilis. Then the secondary neuron will then travel, all right, it will desiccate and cross over. It'll enter into the medial lemniscus and then travels up to the thalamus, where it will then synapse onto the tertiary neuron. Then the tertiary neuron will then but it will end up into the primary somatosensory cortex there, okay, in the parietal lobe. All right, so that's the medial lemniscal pathway. Let's talk about the anterior lateral pathway, okay? This pathway is going to incorporate rough or crude touch, pressure, pain, and temperature. Again, 3-neuron chain, okay? So the primary neuron, similar, all right, except in this case, all right, it's going to synapse in the spinal cord instead of the brainstem. So the primary neuron is going to travel from the skin, all right, up the arm there, into the spinal cord, through the posterior roots, all right, and then it's going to enter into the spinal cord through the posterior horn. All right, so our spinal cord has a gray H. All right, so this is white matter, and then all this is gray matter. Okay, so that primary neuron comes in, it enters into the posterior horn here. Okay, that's the posterior horn. All right, so it enters into the posterior horn, and we're going to see, well, why am I drawing you a horrible picture when I can actually show it to you? All right, we can see that primary neuron comes into the gray horn, synapses onto the secondary neuron. Then that secondary neuron will cross over or decussate, all right, through the center here of our gray matter to the contralateral side here of the spinal cord, and then it'll ascend up through the brainstem, all right, all the way to the thalamus, where it will then, all right, synapse onto the tertiary neuron, and then that tertiary neuron again will travel to the primary somatosensory cortex. So you can kind of see a pattern here, all right, that the tertiary neuron is pretty much always going to go, all right, to the cerebral cortex, all right? It's located in the thalamus, all right, and then it travels to the cerebral cortex here. All right, so the second, let me go back. All right, so the primary neuron enters into the spinal cord, heads to the posterior horn there, where it's going to synapse onto the secondary neuron. That secondary neuron will cross over or decussate, and it's going to travel on the opposite side, the contralateral side, in the white matter. Remember, white matter is going to be, all right, myelinated axons, okay? And it has a choice. It's either going to travel in the anterior spinal thalamic tract or it's going to travel in the lateral spinal thalamic tract. And then those will travel up to the thalamus and synapse onto the tertiary neurons in the thalamus and then head towards the primary somatosensory cortex there. And that's what we're seeing here. All right, anterior spinal thalamic tract or the lateral spinal thalamic tract. Either or, it's going to travel through the same, it's going to travel up to the same destination, to the thalamus there. All right, let's do the last sensory pathway and then we'll take a break here, okay? The spinal cerebellar pathway, and again, when you look at the names of these pathways, you can tell, right, where they're going. The spinal cerebellar pathway is going to wind up, all right, in the cerebellum. This is a 2-neuron chain. So the primary neuron is always going to start off in the periphery, all right, in the skin, our fingertip, head to the spinal cord here, all right, enters into the back portion of the spinal cord through the spinal nerve and the posterior root there, okay, and then it's going to synapse on the secondary neuron in the posterior horn there, okay. Thing that you need to understand about the cerebellar tracts is that they are ipsilateral, okay? They don't cross, okay? So this secondary neuron, all right, what it will do is it will then, show you. So here you can see, all right, that primary neuron comes into the gray horn here, synapses onto the secondary neuron, and that secondary neuron stays ipsilateral, okay? And it travels up, all right, through the medulla oblongata into, all right, the appropriate portions here of the cerebellum, okay? So that keeps it on the same side. So again, we have 2 tracts that it can actually travel through, the anterior spinal cerebellar tract or the posterior spinal cerebellar tract. All right, but both of those will stay, all right, ipsilateral. All right, questions for me? Cerebellar tracts aren't the most exciting, I can tell. You guys, I don't see a lot of enthusiasm coming from you folks. But that's all right. Okay, that's all I want to cover today for the spinal cord. Let's take a break here. And